again to the third session of Unpacking Rural Deep Canvassing. My name's Olga Liapi-Smuzzy. Really excited to be here with all of you today, and I am joined by my co-facilitator, Scott. Scott, you want to say anything here at the top?
Just a hello, welcome. Thanks for rocking up again tonight. And I'm the organizer that helps cover Minnesota and Indiana. And I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota tonight. Nice to see you all.
And I am on the training team here at Indivisible, and yes, just so excited to be jumping in. We've got a lot to cover tonight. This is a packed agenda, so I say let's just jump right into it. As a little preview, y'all, if you are joining us for the first time, that is absolutely okay. Here's where we've been so far. In the first two sessions, we've learned skills from nonviolent communication and really focused on the first three steps of a deep canvassing conversation. That includes empathetic listening, how to start the conversation, and even sharing our vision and our story. And then next week is our last session. Where we're going is we're headed towards some actual practice time. So we're going to wrap up the full conversation today, if all goes well. And then at the next session, you'll have a chance to really work on your own deep canvassing script for a campaign that you have in mind. And we'll even be here, we'll have a chance to hear from folks who are doing this type of work in the field in real life. But this week, today, is all about, like I said, the conversation. So we'll do a little bit of review here at the top of just where we kind of left off last week, which was on step 3 of a deep canvassing conversation. So how do we share our vision and share our story? And then we'll transition into the last 2 steps, reconciling conflicting views and the call to action or the ask. And then we'll do several rounds of practice. Okay, a few space norms. I feel like at this point we know all of this, but just in case, we are recording and all materials will be shared with everyone after today's session. If you don't receive it, just email us at training@indivisible.org. We have captions available. You can turn them on in the control bar. Stay muted when you're not speaking, please, but feel free to share your video. We absolutely love having at least a little bit of video connection. And then we ask that you use the chat box with balance, but that we very much welcome questions, and please just put question in front and we'll try to get to them as many as we can. Okay, are we ready? Yeah, no, I don't see any nodding head. Okay, all right. I don't see everybody's video, so it's possible that some of you are nodding, but let's get into it. Okay, so here's our conversation guide, y'all. We've spent a lot of time with this. So our definition of deep canvassing, just for anybody who wasn't here on the first week, deep canvassing is a voter outreach method that centers two-way candid conversations where canvassers ask voters to share their relevant, emotionally significant experiences and to reflect on them. And the way that we do that is through these 5 steps that are on your screen right now. We start by beginning the conversation. This is where we introduce ourselves briefly, we share with people why it is that we're talking to them today, and we immediately jump into a question to engage the voter into a conversation with us. Step 2, this is where we spend the most of the time in the conversation, ideally, and this is where we're compassionately, empathetically listening to folks. So we're turning our full attention on them and asking questions that are related to the issue at hand to unearth some of those beliefs and start the process of understanding where this voter stands on the issue. Step 3 is where we transition to sharing the campaign message and union vision. And then what we're going to do today is really focus on reconciling conflicting views, the 4th step. This is where we deal with commonly we have conflicting views that pop up in the conversation, not always, but this is the step where we really kind of process that with the voter before we come to the call to action or the ask. 2 things to know about this conversation, however, is that it's not always linear. And to be honest, the fact that it's not always linear, maybe that sounds a little intimidating, but I have found in my own personal experience that can be a good thing. Because even if a voter pulls us out of the introduction 2 minutes into the conversation and goes directly to reconciling conflicting views, it's okay. Because you can really follow this conversation in any direction and still have a really powerful moment with a voter on the doors or on the phone. But the second rule, the rule of thumb, is that we should be listening for 70% of the time and speaking for 30% of the time. But let's go ahead and kind of focus in on where we left off last week. So sharing your story and your union. There it goes again, sneaking in the word union in there. Don't mind me with my previous union experience. Your vision doesn't necessarily have to be a union vision. So how does this work? When we're sharing our vision or the campaign message, every time that you go on the doors, you want to be really clear with a campaign message about what it is that you're focused on. But here's how you level up this step in the process, this step in the deep canvassing conversation, is you connect that campaign message to a real need that you've identified in the conversation with the voter. Which brings us to what are needs. Again, this is just rapid fire review, just so that we do a little bit of level setting here. Needs are the resources that life requires to sustain itself. This is a concept that comes out of nonviolent communication. But here's how it generally works. It's essentially the deepest truth in what a person is saying. For example, when someone says something like, I'm really concerned that this measure will make crime go up, with the example that there's a city charter measure that is being voted on in November in Minneapolis. This is the real scenario we were working with last week. If someone says this, it could be that they have an underlying need around safety. Another example, I think that the city council is pushing this through too quickly. There could be an underlying need there around choice. And then finally, will this make my taxes go up? I'm already paying too much. There could be a potential need here around fairness. We don't know whether these needs are actually what's really going on unless we ask the voter, but here's the concept of how we're kind of drawing out the thing that is underneath people's statements. So to bring it back to the campaign message, go ahead here, don't mind the slide. Okay, here we go. Here's the campaign message. So we have two options here. Again, we're in this scenario in Minneapolis where we're passing a city charter amendment to change community policing, community safety. The sort of generic campaign message is, what matters to me most with this issue is ensuring a truly safe city for the people I care about and for all of us. But how we level it up is by saying, it sounds like having a safe city matters to you too, based on what you told me about your uncle. But this would only really be possible if you drew out a story around safety about that person's uncle earlier on in the conversation. Okay, so we've gone ahead and we've shared this campaign message, ideally connected it to a need that we identified with the voter. Then we respond with our personal story that relates to the issue or action at hand, and we end with a question. Scott, do you want to talk about stories a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's right. So I get to talk about stories for the next few slides. And the first thing to note, so we're going to show you the story from last week again. And now we're going to break it down a tiny bit, and then we're going to ask you all to sort of chime in with your response, either in the chat or maybe there'll be some time for folks who want to come off mute. And this slide breaks down the 4 parts of a solid story, right? The introductory statement. This is going to come after your campaign statement, right? So, and it's going to align the campaign with you, and you're going to start into what the second component is your personal story. In this case, that takes up the biggest chunk of time, and so be it. That's right. And then you're going to end on a hope statement and a question that turns it back on them and asks them to process something very important, which in this case is going to be their value of safety versus the experience of my cousin. Okay, so we're going to get to the story now. Yeah, I got to make this a little bigger, Olga, for a second here. Eyes aren't what they used to be, right? So, yeah, well, you know, for me, the reason I'm volunteering to transform public safety in Minneapolis is because something really scary happened 4 years ago with my cousin Henry. Henry was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he and I grew up together, right? We were climbing trees at our grandparents. We were doing vacations at the beach together, talking about our first dates, you know, as we got older. And then when I was still in college, I got a call from Henry's older brother, my older cousin, and it terrified me. He told me that Henry had had an episode and had left their home in the suburbs of New York, didn't take his phone, didn't even have his shoes on, and walked barefoot into the Bronx. And you can imagine, we didn't know where he was, or they didn't know where he was. And so like, it was only a few hours, it was like hours later when my aunt and uncle got a call that he was with the police, but he'd actually been arrested by the police because a woman in the neighborhood had called the cops hoping to get him the help that he needed, which wasn't being arrested. And what shook me so deeply about all this was that this woman had wanted to get him help, but her only option was calling the police. That's the only people that pick up the 911. The police, as a result of the arrest, inflicted more psychological damage on Henry. And I felt, really relieved. And then I felt kind of shamedly relieved when I realized that my cousin was also white and had not been physically hurt by the police. But I also knew some of the things that I've been seeing on social media about police responding to people of color having mental health episodes. So I felt angry and I felt powerless. There was no mental health counselors or social workers who could have been called instead. And so that's why I support the Minneapolis Charter Amendment, because I know real safety for my family would have meant a social worker, not a police officer, being called to help my cousin Henry. And that's exactly what this amendment will allow us to do. What do you think about that? And can you see where the hope statement is, obviously the question at the end is pretty clear. And then the introductory statement at the beginning. I think if we go to the next slide, we have it highlighted to make it a little more clear. Okay, and the yellow part's the big story in the middle. What's on the next slide, Olga? Okay, great. Let's take a minute to maybe dissect this a little bit and to think about what makes a good story good for a particular canvas. You didn't get a lot of this kind of guidance on the homework for the story that you wrote. So I thought maybe we should take a little time to explore that a little bit. So I'm gonna keep the chat open. And if you could answer some of these questions in the chat as we sort of hive mind what makes this a good story. Or you could critique it and say, I would have done it like this, or I think it might have been more powerful this way. Does your story have to be true? Ethically, yes. Ethically, yes. I think partly what, if you want to be a good canvasser, I guess you could be a good liar, but deep down you are having emotional, vulnerable conversations with folks. It would be really, really awful if you went through an entire campaign lying about your personal story. I wouldn't do it. I think the trick to that is if you haven't got a personal story, borrow someone else's. And there's 3 layers to that. One is this happened to me. The second is it happened to my cousin. The third is I have a friend. Somebody, and you, as part of your brainstorming, you can actually talk. So I've done this. I talked to some friends. I said, well, I'm going on a deep canvas about policing. What are your stories around policing? What's happened? I didn't end up using any of those, but that's something that you can do. Yep, Jody nailed it. So we've got some things in the chat. The story worked for me. It was credible, believable, and personal. Sandra, it focuses on the issue at hand, leads the listener to think about how it could be different, shows vulnerability in both storyteller and in the relative. Yep, I feel vulnerable sharing that story. I feel like I might be judged, and so that's actually one of the emotions that might be telling you you're telling a good story. Okay, yeah, these are all good. It seems like it was a bit too long. You were doing all the talking for quite a long time. I think that's fair. If you're feeling that your story is too long and that folks are tuning out, maybe try a shorter story. I think the other problem though is if you tell it too short, it doesn't draw the person in. Okay, there's a lot in there, and I'm kind of getting lost as it sort of flies through. So that's really great. A couple things I wanted to point out was, well, we did talk about the fact that you can that another type of story is a story where you had an episode or something happened to you. You know, that's often the case. Second is a loved one or a personal friend. And one of the stories that I tell is about somebody who spends a lot of time at the bus stop near my house. And oftentimes he gets agitated, and it's tricky because I'm in a difficult situation where I can't call the police because I'm not sure how the police are going to respond to him. He needs a different sort of help, and I don't have that to hand. So I tell a similar story to that. I think some of the main points to pull out of this are that it absolutely offers a different perspective, and it still revolves around safety. And I'm just gonna kind of foreshadow a little bit of like dealing with the conflicts that might come up later. One of the main things that you're trying to do is put in the voter's head cognitive dissonance between their value system, which in this case is we all value safety. We all value safety for our friends, our family, our loved ones, and the fact that the current system didn't keep my cousin safe. And so maybe they're living in a world where they care about safety and they think policing isn't broken. So my alternative story tells them not that they're wrong, that there are some things working about policing, but that there are also some things about the system that aren't working that's create a conflict. My cousin wasn't safe in that situation. And that should create a cognitive dissonance for the voter between his or her values of safety and the actual lived experience of somebody that I can import into their world. Maybe they'd never thought of this before. So I'm creating an alternative, and some of you really nailed that in the chat too. So I'm just gonna, Olga, if I can have like 10 seconds to look through the chat here. Okay, lots of good stuff in being recycled through the chat. Thank you, everybody. So what are we gonna do next? What's on that next slide? Aha, okay, so we're gonna have breakouts later, I promise, but this is gonna be solo work time, 5 minutes. And you've got we're suggesting 3 options. One is, if you haven't had a chance to write your story, take this 5 minutes now to write a story. If you have written your story, you can fine tune it now. You can think, okay, maybe it was a bit long. Maybe it didn't have some of the components that I saw in the chat here that seemed to be important. So you can use this 5 minutes to fine tune your story. And if you're feeling good about that, you can study the rest of the script conversation, because in a little bit, we're going to start practicing components of the script, and then eventually the whole script we're going to get through tonight. So in the chat, we're going to drop the personal story handout, and we're going to drop the whole script conversation guide. And Olga, can I hand back to you and you can kind of set the timer for 5 minutes?
Yeah, that sounds great. We'll go ahead and start it right now. So 8:24, we'll go until 8:29. Excellent. Thank you for whoever started the recording, so we didn't lose track of that. And welcome back, everybody. We want to just keep chugging along. So just really quickly in the chat box, or you can do kind of thumbs up. How are you all feeling about your story? Did you get some good feedback inside of your sessions? Are you feeling nice and confident? We can do thumbs up or thumbs down if you're still feeling unsure. Okay, we've got a bunch of thumbs up. Yes, that is so great to hear and see. Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, we're going to keep playing with it. So let's go into reconciling conflicting views. So you're in this conversation, you've gone ahead and you've introduced yourself, you have talked about why you're there, you've jumped immediately into a question. You've gotten the conversation going, you've understood what this person's experience is with police, you've understood kind of like what their hesitations might be, and then you've shared your story. And then we have this moment here between sharing your story and vision between step 3 and step 4, where typically the voter shares where they stand now. Because remember, we're ending step 3 with a question. And depending on what the voter shares with you there, you might make a number of different decisions about where to take the conversation. If the person is super with you right away, you can go immediately to the ask. But if the person unearths something that's a legitimate hesitation about how to go ahead and about the issue at hand that you're canvassing on, then the goal of your next step of step 4 is to encourage them to reconcile the two stories, the story that they shared with you that you unearthed through empathetic listening in step 2 and your story. And the way that we do this is with a 3-part formula. So I want to look at an example. Let's say that you ask, okay, so how does that sound to you? And the person responds by saying, I have people in my family who are police officers, and they put their body on the line every day for our safety. You're like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? The 3 parts to the formula is to empathize. And I don't mean empathize on everything that the person is saying, but instead empathize with the underlying need of what they're saying, answer briefly, but be very brief in our response, because remember, facts don't change people's minds. So we want to give enough information to counter the idea, but not so much information that we start arguing. And then end this portion with a redirect. This is what it looks like. I agree with you that there are many excellent police officers who are hardworking, and most police officers are asked to do too much. When police are responding to everything and must use the same tactics to solve everything, communities are left rocked by violence. That's why this charter is so exciting, because it allows for more flexibility in how we respond to people who need help. Do you think the police officers in your family would benefit from not going on mental health calls when a social worker could handle it? So you see here, y'all, it's not that we're going to argue about whether somebody's family is a good cop or a bad cop. That is not going to lead to any kind of good conversation. Instead, you're really talking about here's how the system still doesn't currently work, and then you're engaging them in a follow-up question that continues the conversation. Empathize, answer briefly, redirect. Here's another example of what this can look like. But what if the answer was to give more training to the police? What if police officers need more funding rather than less? I definitely understand the desire to give police officers more training. More training feels like potentially a good answer. But here's the deal. We've learned that continued training actually doesn't work. Minneapolis spent $179 million last year in policing, and it hasn't made us safer. That's why this charter is a new idea, because we've already tried the training avenue. What would you need to see to know that this charter was the right next step? So once again, we're not arguing with them on what their idea is. We're simply sharing enough facts about why that doesn't really make sense and isn't a better option than what the charter is. Okay, but you might be asking to yourself, okay, but how am I supposed to know all this stuff? How am I supposed to know the brief answer to every single thing that comes up on the doors? The truth is that, you know, all of us get stumped sometimes, and that's okay. Good scripts, and when you're writing your own script, in the instances where you're running your own deep canvassing, you want to think about these brief answers. So good scripts will provide these quick rebuttals, but sometimes the talking point won't work perfectly, or it won't come to our mind in that moment, and that's okay. The longer, in my experience, the longer that I am on a campaign, the more understanding I have about the most common rebuttals that come up on the door. So it's gonna become easier as you're doing it. I really do promise. But you can always mix and match, learn from your experience, and it is okay to point people to a website and then move on to the next step if you're a little bit lost about how to respond. Which brings us to the final step. Dun, dun, dun. A quick interlude before I go into the language of the final step. for those of you, let's just get a quick set of hands. If people don't mind using the raise hand feature, how many of you have participated in the deep canvassing campaign or effort? Yeah, we've got lots of hands coming up. Yeah, okay. Great, 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 great. So for those of you who have participated, you already know this, but it is a very standard operating procedure for deep canvassing campaigns to have a numerical system that helps you do this work, do this voter contact outreach. The numerical system that's being used for the Minneapolis campaign is a pretty standard one. 1 is absolutely against the measure, 5 is somewhere in between, and 10 is absolutely for it. So you're rating the voter on a 10-point scale. And we do want to make a quick point here that collecting numerical data and using one consistent way to track your numerical data is really, really important, in my opinion, for deep canvassing campaigns, because that's what's going to give you the ability to make strategic decisions. So keeping that in mind, we know we have this 10-point scale. Our final call to action is, so when you bring it all together on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is you're absolutely against this, 10 you're absolutely for it, 5 is somewhere in the middle, where would you put yourself at this point? And then you stay quiet. It's called a pregnant pause. When I was a brand new organizer, I used to always talk through the pregnant pause. Don't do it, y'all. You want to let the person actually decide for themselves where they are. And especially if you had a genuine, vulnerable, true conversation with the person, you have brought up something potentially that's really different from how they saw the world. They need a second to really think about where they are right now. So once we pause this question, once we've said this question, we stop talking. Okay, so now we're going to practice the whole shebang, the whole thing. You're going to have 30 minutes in your breakout. Oh, excuse me, I went too far. We're going to put you into pairs of 2. So once again, if you're not able to participate, that's okay. Just put a star in front of your name. But we really do want people to be in 2s, just so you have a chance to have this full conversation. One person plays the person at the door, one person plays the canvasser. And what we want you to do is to use the handout. I'll go ahead and just share it really quickly here. Can you all see the handout now on your screens instead of the PowerPoint? Yes, okay, great. So this is the handout that we shared in the chat, and if one of my colleagues could please share it again. I'm just scrolling up to the top to show you all. We've got the campaign details here at the top if you want to remind yourself of this scenario in case you weren't here last week. It's the same scenario, real life, that's going on in Minneapolis. And we want you to try the full conversation. So go through the beginning of the conversation. You've got the intro questions here, and this time we made sure to include all the details here for you. Step 2, empathetic listening. This is where we're listening all the way to step 5. Any questions before we go into breakouts?
Olga, can I say something real quick about that? You know, asking them where they are on the scale of 1 to 10.
Please.
Okay. One of the things I put in the chat there, like asking them to speak their views on this, it doesn't just give you great data, but it allows them to kind of rehearse what they heard in their heads and out loud. And this is like one of the beautiful things about the way deep canvassing works, is that triggers the active processing parts of their brains. And what's really, really cool about this is that even if they don't move on that scale of 1 to 10, because sometimes you ask them in the beginning where they are, and then you ask them at the end, and you had a great conversation, but they only moved 1 or 2 places. But because you've let them speak it out, because you've engaged them in this process at a deeper values level and at a level of more active processing, they can continue to move after you hang up. They can continue to move after you walk away from the door, because it's gotten in. And they need to process it in their brains. So that's a really positive thing to keep in mind in those moments where you feel a little bit deflated that, oh, I didn't move them as far as I thought. They can keep moving. They'll remember you. Thanks, Olga. Just want to pop that in there.
Oh, that's so great, Scott, because it's true. We can't always make all of the move. Like, we can't always get people to be completely on our side on the doors. And a lot of times people will keep thinking about this stuff. I completely agree. Sean, on your question, when you're playing the voter, we kind of talked about this last time about being medium hard, where it's like, don't be a 10 on the scale, right? It's not about a person who's already supporting, but let's not be Blue Lives Matter either. It's just somewhere in the middle where you have some concerns, and think about a concern that you are genuinely feeling like you might encounter on the doors, and go ahead and share that. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time because I want to give y'all time to really do this. So, Rachel, are we ready for the breakouts?
I believe we are. Might have one room with 3 people. So we'll see if everyone gets joined, and if not, we'll switch your room. Here we go.
And go ahead, y'all. You'll have to press the actual button to join the breakouts. Yep, I see people doing it now. That's great. Turn the hat. Welcome back, everyone. Doris and Christy, and we'd love to hear how it went. I mean, it's already 9:30, at least on the East Coast, depends on where you are. But definitely want to acknowledge that we're going over like we have the last couple times. It's really hard to fit all this content into even an hour and a half. So we invite you to stay. We'll stay a little bit longer to answer questions and just hear from all of you about how that went. If you've got to hop off, we also understand that. Let me just share a couple things quickly to make sure that you all have a chance to see this. There we go. Scott, do you want to say a little bit about the office hours that that you're offering while people are trickling back into the room before we start answering questions?
Yeah, it's pretty okay. So we moved pretty quickly from the breakout where you got to share your stories and get feedback. And one of the ways that we did that, because we had to get going and get done by in 90 minutes. However, if you have questions about the storytelling or things that you wanted more feedback on, or nuances or what have you, I don't have the answers to everything, but super happy to work through some of that stuff with you. I've set aside an hour tomorrow. Hopefully that can work. And there it is on the slide, 3 to 4 Central Time. There's that call link. We should put that in the chat as well. And so it'll be a video call. You could say off video if you don't want, but I'll be on video. And I think the other thing to say about that might be, yeah. And if you can't make that, we're gonna have a bigger, longer Q&A at the end of part 4, right, Olga? And so save your questions or for that, and we'll try to get them processed then. That sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to stop sharing then, just so that we can see all of you. And this is the part where we're just answering questions. We want to know what came up. How did it go when you tried the full conversation? Feel free to unmute or jump into the chat to say that you want to be unmuted. We want to hear, how did it go?
Are we supposed to just jump in?
Go for it, Sandy. Yeah.
I personally have some problems with the social worker being called and not the police, because the social worker could be put into harm's way. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to turn mine. And the woman I was talking with, she said, well, when it was my turn to talk, why don't you keep going? I said, no, I can do it. So I went and I talked and I gave the reasons about this, which was a true story. And I still feel it's got to be a combined operation.
It sounds to me there, Sandy, like you, I mean, it is true that if you have your own sort of hesitations about the city charter, for example, then I think I would definitely urge kind of like processing that out, and we can talk about that here. Like what is the thing that comes to mind for you that makes you nervous about a social worker taking a call that's like a mental health call, for example, who's someone who needs help in the community?
Because the way the call is, it's a public safety issue.
May I say something?
Yeah.
I don't live in Minneapolis, so I really don't have a lot of facts about the charter, but it was my understanding, and I hope from something, I forget, one of my early partners said in San Diego, where it's a team. There's a police officer and a social worker that go on the call, so that the social worker isn't there by him or herself. There's a police officer also to deal with the situation if it's becomes a safety and violent issue, which is what the police are supposed to do, not mental health counseling or whatever.
I agree with that totally. Is it a team? I don't know.
As
Can
a
be.
firefighter, we often, if it looks like it's a threatening situation, we make sure before we intervene, we have a police officer present. But there are a lot of situations that don't require that, medical conditions and that we go to all the time. The police may show up if they have nothing to do, but they're not in charge and they're in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sandy, what it boils down to, and of course this differs on everyone's kind of thinking here, but what it comes down to for me is that there's a built-in assumption that police officers equal safety. But that built-in assumption isn't there for all of us. It's more likely to be there if you're white. It's certainly like more likely to be there if you've had good experiences with police officers, if you have police officers in your family. But when you look at the numbers, the bottom line of it is that the assumption that police will make a situation more safe doesn't actually turn out to be true. And what this city charter amendment in particular, which I think those of us who have done the deep canvassing, for example, Scott, you can speak to this even more than I can, but have actually done the phone calls around this campaign. But the bottom line of this city charter, in my opinion, is that it allows for flexibility with how communities and officers and cities can actually respond to emergency situations without the assumption that police are going to make it better.
No, but is it going to be a team? Because being a team makes sense to me.
Yeah,
Sandy,
that's part of it. Yep. And they'll have worked this all through for sure. And like one side of it is if you don't want to do a canvas on something, that's totally cool. The other side of it is also sometimes you can move through processes and try something new, but you can't try anything new as long as there's a monopoly on power.
Right.
And you can always course correct too. So I think that's the thing that progressives need to remember. Like, you don't need to get it all right in one. Like, you can try something and, maybe it's better, but there's still things you need to bring back from the old way, or you innovate moving forward.
But my question is,
good comment. Good comment.
in Minneapolis, is it going to be a team? Is it going to be a team, meaning social workers and police together? Or is it going to be a social worker being called out?
Yeah, I think that's an option, but I don't know, Sandy, for sure. I don't know.
My guess is it would be a call from the 911 operator.
Right. Could I just, I just want to say that I have found myself in, and I'm trying to remember what it was, where I was not in 100% agreement with what it was. I think it was a local municipality charter amendment. I'm trying to remember what it was now. Where I wasn't fully on board. Like, I wasn't on board with all parts of it. I had reservations. And I was able to, you know, in the conversation, if it came up, I was able to say, I mean, I'm a embarrassingly transparent person, so that did come right out that, you know, when that thing comes up, it's like, well, I agree with you. I'm not usually comfortable with this, but all the rest of this is so great. And this is my story and why, even though I have some reservations, this is why I am supporting this. And I hope, you know, I think it's a step in the right direction or whatever it was. I feel like, but I mean, we're different people. We're often not going to be 100% on board with the things that we're trying to canvas about. And I think it's okay to be honest and share your reservations as long as, you know, you have the good reasons for why you are supporting it. My 2 cents, like I said, embarrassingly transparent.
Hey, transparency is not a bad thing at all. Karen, I see your hand too. Thank you for sharing that, Giodi.
Hey, sorry, hope you can hear me. I'm in the middle of a bunch of yard work, rural area. But I just wanted to speak to the issue. It sounds like when you keep asking, is there going to be a social work team? Very few calls, in my experience, whether it's cops or whatever, end up with just a single person going to any kind of call. But it sounds like you might be engaging in a little bit of status quo bias, where you're assuming that just because because of the way things work right now is cops get called to everything, right? And we're talking about a possible alternative where different people with different specialties might get called to something like that. And assuming that, and when we look at the outcomes when only police are called to those kinds of things, there often ends up being harm. And sometimes that harm is because the cops are escalating the situation just because the person is terrified. I've helped some homeless folks in my area move away from a sweep. They call it a cleanup. And there was a woman who had had bad experiences with cops, and now she was agitated, right? I didn't feel unsafe, but I have some experience, right? Somebody else might, but she saw a cop who had mistreated her before, and she got terrified. She was hiding behind my car. Like, her crisis was exponentially worse because there were cops on the scene. And I'm not a social worker, but I was just able to say, you know what, he doesn't see you. It's okay. Let's get in the car and we'll get away. And as soon as we were like a block away, she calmed right down and she was totally fine. And it was just heartbreaking to see how terrified she was. And so a lot of folks have had bad experiences with the police. And I totally understand wanting to make social workers be safe too, right? Mental health care providers in lots of facilities, in lots of places and hospitals, they do face some risk. But I don't know if you have anyone in your life who is in that kind of role, but they're generally very trained to handle these kinds of situations. And as long as they are with another person, one solution might be, an unarmed plainclothes kind of, somebody who's formally trained in de-escalation, but can also handle, if a more violent situation arises. Lots of other countries have police officers who don't even have guns on them, for example. They have specific teams that are brought in if there's like an armed shooter. Everyone else just doesn't have a gun. So there's lots of other alternatives. And I think the charter is about, from what I understand, it's about making room for those alternatives. So that's my 2 cents. Sorry, that got a little long.
No, Karen, I loved it. And I also just want to take a moment to just point out, Karen, what you did was like, if we took a portion of what you said there, it was exactly the formula that we're talking about with dealing with conflicting views, because we know we're going to have conflicting views inside of ourselves as well. And the bottom line, like your response to you, Sandy, was empathizing first. The point of this is not to put social workers in danger. And I totally understand not wanting to put social workers in danger. But we know that police officers don't equal safety. And so the only part that was missing, Karen, was only a redirect question, which of course wasn't necessary in this instance, but that's an example of how we really want to respond to these kinds of moments. And we might even be having them inside of ourselves because we're deciding how we feel about these changes as well. Okay, I want to make sure that we get to at least a couple other questions. Neil, I see your hand up. Is it about this or is it about a new topic?
it's about this. I just got a comment that most of us don't have a whole lot of information about the details of what's actually being proposed, even the nature of the amendment, let alone the follow-on from the amendment. So let's just suppose that the amendment is approved, and the city council. Ultimately, the city council is going to make some decisions to flesh that out, and then ultimately other agencies are going to make other decisions to flesh out what actually happens on the ground. And you can just tell from our conversation that everybody knows that the devil is in the details. So even if the amendment was approved, and even if the city council made reasonable choices about what to do with it, it could still be an utter disaster if the implementation is not right.
I'm not sure I would suggest calling it an utter disaster on the doors or on the phone call, though. But I definitely agree with you that the devil is in the details. All right.
Jyoti's transparency there might be an obstacle. Most of the time, I think it's really good, but yeah. But I do think there's a good point here of like really acknowledging that as somebody who's a deep thinker about stuff. And if they said the devil's in the details, I wouldn't say, oh no, you're wrong. It would come down to, who do we trust here? And and in that case, we get into like progressive values versus conservative values in a way. It's like, well, I can trust, somebody who says I trust, the authoritarian figure who's going to get it right. Whereas my case is going to be more like, I'm really looking for opportunities for as much public input as possible, because I believe that together we can work this out and get this right. And that's why accountability matters to me. That's why. So it's a good point, Neil. I mean, everyone's making good points. Yeah, that's what I'd say. Yeah.
When I was involved with community policing, we had a feedback mechanism, once a month meeting, where a lot of those difficulties got worked out, and different emergency responders have different roles and they're in charge in different situations. And when we get called out from 911 operators, we often get really faulty information that has to be correct. The details are really the devil.
Joanne, let's go to you next.
Yes, I know you've emphasized that facts don't change people's minds, and I get that. But in all the conversations and practices that I had today, none of us were from Minneapolis, and we knew very little about the charter. And really, as canvassers, I think you do have to know the facts, because often there were issues and questions that we couldn't respond to very well because we didn't have facts. And I'm not saying you have to throw out a bunch of facts at the people, but you do have to know what it's about.
I definitely, in my experience, the more conversations I have, the more I understand the go-to talking point facts that I need. Oh gosh, I lost sight of you there, Joanne. Oh, there you go. Okay, found you again. But I would say one thing is that it can be a little tempting to get to the peripheral part of what a person is asking. Let's take Sandy, your hesitation around this. We could get into a discussion on the doors or on a phone banking conversation about what the details of this city charter amendment could look like. But we also know that in the process of things being passed, which has been mentioned here before, things do change. So our job isn't to make promises about exactly what the city charter is going to be like. Our job is to help people process conflicting views. So if the conflicting view is, I don't want to put a new set of people in danger as a result of this charter, that's the thing to unpack. So what I guess my advice or what I'm saying is, if you're feeling yourself stuck on facts that you're not sure about, try going a layer deeper. Try to ask a question like, why does that piece of information feel so critical for you to know? And then you're unearthing like, what is the true deepest part of the hesitation the person is experiencing, even if you don't know every single fact associated with it. Scott, anything you would add to that?
It does give a I mean, there's a massive difference in your comfort zone when you just start a campaign as opposed to when you're doing it for a couple weeks. And good campaign organizers will have thought through a lot of the details, and they'll give you a crib sheet, and they'll give you talking points, and they'll give you a lot of things that you can fall back on and get really familiar with.
Mhm.
And that's helpful as well. And the important thing about a training like this and what you'll get on a deep values canvas is that's sort of your last resort. That's like, you hopefully don't have to go there at all. But if you need to just do a quick rebuttal here or a quick pivot there, these are some of the facts of the matter. Usually if somebody's drilling down with you, they're interested. Rather, if they just want to argue with you, maybe you can kind of sense that this isn't really worth your time. But somebody who really wants to work stuff out with you, they're probably worth, bringing up some of that content that they're asking about, which you'll get from, the sheet that comes with your script. And with campaigns, it's the classic is, hey, do you mind if I give your phone number to the candidate and she'll give you a call and you can work this one out? That's a really good one. In this case, you can also pass on a website. You can pass on, usually website or literature. Yeah.
Yeah. Joanne, did you have a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, I wasn't saying that your whole conversation should be about facts and so on, but if you need to get to the person's underlying needs, I quite understand that and how important that is to really be able to address what it is they're concerned about. But I think you need to have the background in order to support your argument, or maybe I shouldn't say arguments, but your statements about that. Not so much that you're, just saying, well, it does this, it does this, it does this, et cetera. But so you can speak from knowledge. And I get totally that you need to figure out what their need is. Is it safety? Is it whatever? So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And like Scott said, campaigns give that. And, we're working through things really quickly in order to give you all enough time to practice. So, in some cases, we're just making decisions about how much we can fit in an hour and a half. Is there more to this campaign? And is there research that you could do, especially before you have a real conversation with a voter? Definitely. And that's only going to make your conversation stronger. Okay. It's 9:51, y'all. Any other final questions before we wrap it up for the night? We can take one more, I feel like.
All right. How do you decide the 911 operator who goes, the police or the social worker? How does that 911 operator decide?
Sandy, let's hold on to that question.
Okay.
I'm wondering about questions about the conversation in particular. So let's put aside the questions about the campaign, just because I think we could get into the details of that all night. And
Okay.
Sandy, maybe me and you, or me, you and Scott, maybe we can have a follow-up conversation on something on that. But, or is there anything that came out of actually practicing the 5 steps of the conversation? Any questions related to that? And it's also okay if there aren't any.
This may be and we don't have to talk about it, it's too late kind of, but for instance, Scott's story was about shifting to a different aspect of policing, so it got away from criticizing police currently. And in the breakout rooms that I was in, and like my story, they're about outrages of what police are currently doing, whether from a racial viewpoint or whatever. So it didn't manage to skirt that part. Does that make any sense?
Are you asking about kind of how your story connects to what you're actually hearing from the person?
Well, that's a good point. But but when we were developing our story, even before that, one thing about Scott's story was he had this way of, he was skirting, he wasn't criticizing what police were currently doing,
Mhm,
except that they were giving jobs that they weren't suited for.
mhm.
Several, the stories in the breakout room, the one I wrote and the others were, and I didn't come up with something, so they were actually ones that were upset about current episodes that have happened that police have done.
Mhm, mhm,
And that feels riskier to me. At the same
Mhm.
time, do you have thoughts?
Yeah. The the level 2 of this is to have multiple stories. It's to have a slightly riskier story, and it's to also have a story that does not criticize or is not particularly critical of police officers. And then you decide in the moment which one or which ones is going to be the most relevant for that conversation. Because I do think, Charlotte, you're right that you can get little cues, right, of what is it that, how critical of a story do I want to share in this moment to really respond to the voter that I'm talking to. I also do think, y'all, you don't have to have your story perfect before you hit the doors. You know the 3 components of a story. It's an intro statement, it's a story itself, it's a hope statement, 4, and then there's the question at the end. If you know those components, you can ad lib it off the top of your head if you kind of have an idea about the kinds of experiences you want to speak about. So it's not about having this perfect story, it's about responding truly to what's going on in the conversation. So I think your instinct is right that some stories may not apply in every single instance, and you want to feel what the conversation is like, what is really happening on the doors, and make a decision in the moment.
You can also take the edge off of some stories, maybe not ones that are straight up current events, but like I was telling a story about, my friends who are raising Black boys as opposed to my experience. And you could take that in a super like confrontational, the police are bad direction. That is not how I was telling it, particularly to a sort of middle of the road person. By the way you close on that, so you could close with, defund the police, probably not the right close for most people. You can also close with, if the police aren't, this charter amendment could reduce the probability that these guys could find themselves in conflict with the police over things where the police really didn't even need to be called. So you can emphasize instead that keeping the police out of, public health situations like mental health crises, all the things where maybe guns and aggression aren't the best solution. It needs to tie back into the conversation that you've already been having, but.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, y'all, it's almost the top of the hour. Thank you for spending 30 extra minutes with us, 27 extra minutes with us. We have one more session next week. Scott, anything you want to share with folks on our way out?
Just gratitude for being here, and office hours tomorrow from yeah, I can't even remember. It's in the chat. 2 to 3 Central Time. 3 to 4
3 to
Central.
4.
Thanks. All right. And
We
have a
have,
great night, everybody. Lots of brain power on this call. It's really dynamic, and it's helping me think stuff through as well, and I really appreciate that.
Do we have homework?
No homework this time around, although we will be sharing by email an invitation to participate in these exact phone banks about this city charter amendment, because what we're going to be sharing next time, Giodi, I see your hand. Yeah. Because what we'll be sharing at the next session is that the best way to actually try this is to try this in real life. So we will be sharing a couple opportunities between today and our next session. But otherwise, just study the 5 parts of the conversation and join us back next week to try out writing an actual script. You'll all have a chance to actually put this into practice with your own issues that you are interested in canvassing about. And if you don't have an issue at hand, don't worry about that either. We'll give you a scenario.
Good night, everyone.
On that
Thank
note, good
you.
night.
Thanks, Olga.
Right.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everyone.